Welcome back to this STEG virtual course on macroeconomic development. The STEG is, again, you guys know this by now, but STEG is a program on structural transformation and economic growth, a research program run by CEPR, funded as part of the UK aid effort by the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, United Kingdom. We're very grateful for their financial support. We're also grateful for Chris Tonetti, who is not receiving much of that financial support. None of the lecturers are receiving much compensation at all. They're doing this out of the goodness of their hearts. So we're especially appreciative of Chris today, who's going to be talking about technology diffusion and giving an overview of models of technology diffusion. And I also want to thank Mandy Chan, Kirsty McNeil, and Lauren Waring for helping with the organization and logistics of the course. Chris will speak for about 75 minutes. Those of you who are in the front row, we ask you to mute while he's speaking. You can unmute if you have a question. We try to stick to clarifying questions during the lecture. Afterwards, bigger picture questions would be more appropriate. For those of you who are joining as a webinar participant, you can enter questions into the Q&A. Doug Gollin and I will do our best to answer those. And those that we can't, or those that are a bit more general, we may leave to Chris if there's time at the end. So with that, let me hand over the reins to Chris. Chris, if you want to share your screen.
So thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here, part of this this lecture series, this course on macro development. And yeah, my supplemental lecture is on technology diffusion and adoption. So here's what I propose that we talk about today. And I'm happy to take questions sort of as I'm presenting, in addition to the questions at the end. So I'll just quickly go over some background material, a little bit on non-rivalry and motivating fact. And then what I'm going to spend most of my time on is exploring some theories of technology diffusion. I think in other lectures, as part of this series of classes, there's going to be more discussion, and has been more discussion, a bit on the empirics of technology diffusion, and maybe a more microeconomic approach to thinking about technology diffusion and adoption. And so what I wanted to do today was try to complement those lectures by developing some structural models of technology diffusion. And I figured I'd focus on two types of models that are very prominent. One is a Nelson Phelps style model of diffusion. Just because it's what I'm most familiar with, I'll use some of the notation from a Journal of Economic Growth paper that I wrote with Ben Habib and Perla. And then I'll spend some time discussing idea diffusion models. And there's a great survey article by Paco Guerra and Bob Lucas that I reference here that'll give you a really nice overview of many different intricacies of the different models of diffusion. What I'm going to do today is sort of walk you through two types of these models, one in discrete time and one in continuous time. And the idea there will be to try to help you understand how to write down micro-founded models of technology diffusion. And we can spend a little bit of time talking about how to bring them to data as well. I'll, at the end, hopefully briefly discuss some models where I think the frontier is of the research literature, trying to think about innovation and the creation of new ideas simultaneously with thinking about idea diffusion. And there's some references there that I'll use to discuss that topic. And I just want to point out and just acknowledge up front that I'm going to be skipping a bunch of models that are prominent, and it's not because I think they're less good. It's in part due to these time constraints and in part due to my lack of knowledge and expertise. And so there's some recent papers on creative destruction and how that facilitates cross-country diffusion of knowledge and ideas and technology. There's great work on networks that can be used, especially when you have a smaller number of agents, people, and you're thinking about how each person is connected to each other person is a really important thing to understand how the technology flows across the population. And there are models of learning that are very closely connected to models of technology diffusion when you take a particular stance on what a technology is, thinking about a technology as an idea. So that's sort of the big picture of where I'm hoping to go in today's class. And my goal is pretty simple. I want to help people have an understanding, sort of a broad overview of some theories of technology diffusion and sort of how the literature has evolved. And more practically, I hope that people that are listening to this lecture get an understanding of these two types of models well enough to use them in your own research and build on them. And so this is really hopefully sort of a class that helps develop tools so that you can just take these tools and hit the ground running in your own research. So one piece of background knowledge that I just want to get on the table because it's so crucial to understanding technology diffusion. One way that economists tend to think of technology is as an idea. It's a blueprint or a recipe. It's a way of combining some ingredients and getting some output. And so you can think about technology sort of in this broad sense. It can be something as simple as oral rehydration therapy, where you just simply combine some water and salt and sugar. And that's a much better way of rehydrating people who are suffering from dehydration, maybe from diarrhea or something like that, than just using water. And these are ingredients that are available to many, many people. But sometimes they're not combined in the right way, in the right recipe, and used when they could be used to save lives and really improve people's health. And so it's just that knowledge, having the idea to combine these things is the limiting factor. It's not necessarily having the ingredients. And so when you think of technology as an idea, non-rivalry is really an obvious, essential concept to understand if you want to think about the diffusion of technology and growth. Ideas are non-rival. And what that means is that any specific blueprint or recipe can be used both in a factory in India and in a factory in Brazil at the same time. Management practices, irrigation practices. That's different than a particular machine, an irrigation pump, or being used in a factory. That one pump or that one machine tool can only be in India or Brazil at one given time. It can't be in both places at both times. And so this is going to motivate the need for distinct models of the distribution and the spread of ideas and technology. We have a lot of models about sort of where physical capital is produced and how it flows across space and across time. Why don't we just relabel physical capital as technology, and then we can just use the models off the shelf? In part, it's because we think a large part of technological progress, this improvement in productivity over time, that can be seen at the aggregate level, but also at the micro level in firms and in workers. We think it has a large part of that has to do with this diffusion of this non-rival component of technology. And the economics of non-rival goods is very different from sort of classical Adam Smith economics. This is in part what Paul Romer won his Nobel Prize for. And it underlies a lot of what's going on in the models that I'm going to show you today. So I just wanted to start off by acknowledging that. The other bit of background that I wanted to bring to the table is just one sort of famous fact that motivates thinking about technology diffusion in the context of rich and poor countries and countries that are growing fast versus countries that are growing slow. So this is a chart taken from Bob Lucas's paper in the first ever issue of AJ Macro. And it plots on the horizontal axis per capita income in 1960. And it's going to rank countries, each dot is a country, by their per capita income sometime in the past, 1960. And on the vertical axis, it has the annual growth rate from 1960 until 2000. So after that initial point where we're ranking them on the horizontal axis. And you can see sort of highly variable growth rates amongst the countries that were initially poor. Whereas the rich countries were growing sort of this constant pace. That's what a lot of growth economics is about. Where is this sort of 2% growth coming from? What Lucas then did is separated countries into open and market-based economies compared to closed economies or economies that were more centrally planned. And the black dots are those open countries. And he described these open countries as that form the this upper edge of the growth triangle here as describing the growth potential for open economies and as demonstrating the equalizing forces operating in the set of open market economies. And the basic idea was that the countries that were furthest behind were the ones that grew the fastest. And that's, there's a long literature on growth dynamics and convergence and things like that. But this is just one way of seeing this simple fact that the countries that were furthest behind and open, connected to each other in a market-based system were the ones that grew fast. And so what he did in his paper, and what I'm going to do over the next few slides, is develop a model that's helps us to understand why it might be that the countries that were the furthest behind might be growing the fastest. And it has some analogs to the simple solo or neoclassical growth model, where if a country is starting well below its steady state, it might grow faster to its steady state than a country closer to its steady state. But there's a lot of growth accounting and development accounting that suggests a large part of this increase rapid growth is not just capital accumulation, but it seems to show up in measures of productivity growth. And so we want a story that goes beyond just the accumulation of capital. So that's a very simple motivation. This class is mostly designed to help you think about models of technology diffusion, but that's just in the back of your mind, one key motivating fact for thinking about what you want the model of technology diffusion to deliver. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time working through some Nelson Phelps style models of diffusion. And this goes all the way back to an AER paper in 1966. And I would say this is kind of like the bread and butter model of diffusion that first comes to my mind as a macroeconomist. It's very simple. It's easy to work with. And certain variations of it are very flexible for allowing and capturing very different patterns of technology diffusion. So what I'll do over the next couple slides is to lay out the basics of this Nelson Phelps model. I'm not going to do it in a very fully articulated version of the model. I'm just going to focus in on the core insight. So for simplicity, let's think about the unit of observation being a country, and let's just think about the population being constant. This is really going to be about productivity dynamics. And there's a frontier country that has the highest level of technological advancement at any point in time. And then there are going to be follower countries. And the follower countries are going to have varying distances to the frontier. Some are going to be, operating with technologies that are almost as productive as the frontier technology. And some are going to be operating with technologies that are much further behind the frontier. And the key idea of the Nelson Phelps model is that the rate of diffusion of technology flowing from the leader to a follower is a function of the distance between the leader and the follower. And the way this works as an economist is that the researcher specifies some differential equation that determines the rate of flow of technology from the leader to the follower. And if you just have the frontier growing at some exogenous rate, this will allow you to get some growth in the long run. But this is really a model not focusing on what might be more traditional growth economics, where innovation comes from in very rich countries. It's more a model designed to focus on diffusion. Wherever this growth is coming from at the frontier, how does it get diffused back to countries that are typically poorer and operating with less productive technology? And a comment I'm going to point out, as you'll see when we go to the math, is that the thing that makes the Nelson-Phelps model so tractable and simple to analyze is because it's framed in a way where everything is pairwise. You can just look at a follower and the leader, and then you can do that follower by follower. You don't have to worry about sort of the entire network of all the followers and how they're connected to each other and how they're connected to the leader. It's just a simple model that says there's some frontier technology and it's going to flow to followers as a function of how far the followers are below the leader. So to put that a little bit more concretely, let's think about country I, who's got some fixed population, L bar of I, and output in that country is just ZI times L. So Z is going to be productivity. And this is going to be a model of how productivity evolves over time. And then we can think about a distribution of productivity Z across countries, but we don't really have to worry about what that distribution is because we're going to be able to focus on country follower pairs. And so let's just focus on a particular Z. And what's really important in this framework is the productivity frontier. And so let's call that F of T, which could be evolving over time. That's just going to be the maximum productivity that's in existence in the planet. So the highest productivity amongst that distribution of productivities across countries. And then the core insight of the Nelson-Phelps style diffusion model is that productivity growth, Z dot over Z, is just going to be given by this exogenous function that we specify. And the key thing that shows up in this function is the ratio of any particular country's productivity Z to the frontier productivity F. And M is going to be a key parameter of the diffusion equation that's going to determine the properties of how quickly technologies flow from the frontier to the followers and other properties that we can discuss now. So I'm just rewriting the law of productivity right there up at the top. And the Nelson-Phelps model was actually a special case of this functional form that I put up here. The Nelson-Phelps model put that M parameter to be -1. And so let's just take a second. I encourage you to take a second and work through the math a little bit. Just see what happens when you put M as -1. Right? That's going to flip the F over the Z. The frontier is bigger than Z by definition. The frontier is the maximum Z. And so this term is going to be negative, but you have a -1 on the outside. So this is going to be a positive term. So that means there's Z bars. Z is going to be growing over time. And when is it going to be growing faster? If it's close to the frontier or if it's further away from the frontier? Well, when M equals -1, you get this quote unquote confined exponential diffusion. And then what that means is the further F the frontier is ahead of the productivity a particular country is using, so the bigger F is compared to Z, the faster the follower country is going to grow. And then this is the baseline model that Bob Lucas used in that AEJ macro paper that I mentioned, of how he tried to explain sort of why those countries that were initially below the frontier grew faster over the 50-year or 40-year period that he studied compared to countries that were at the frontier. And this gives you a model of convergence.
Hello,
Is there a
Chris.
question?
Hello,
Yes,
Chris.
Phillips? I can
Okay.
hear you.
Does this model have any relationship with the gravity model in international trade?
Yeah, so the gravity model in international trade is one of the key, as I understand it, one of the key properties there is the importance of distance to bilateral trade flows.
Yeah.
And so here, this has a similar idea, but it's changing the concept of distance from being geographical distance to being distance in some sort of technology space. And so with physical trade, the gravity model suggests that countries that are close to each other trade a lot, And maybe that's because there are physical trade costs, or maybe that's because of similarities in demand for products or things like that.
Yeah.
This model will say that technology tends to flow quickly, actually to countries that are more dissimilar. And so if you're further away, you have more technology interaction going on between them. So it's related, but it has some different properties. And on the next slide, I think we should talk a little bit about the economic interpretation of this function. And we can talk about why the gravity model might want flows to be bigger when you're close together, and why this model might want flows to be bigger when you're further apart. That's a great question.
Okay, thank you.
And that actually is very natural to segue into the next bullet point here, where we can think about a different model, which is still almost the identical framework, but just with a different parameter. So let's put m equal to 1 instead of -1. This gives you a different kind of differential equation that describes diffusion differently. And in fact, Benabib and Spiegel, in a Handbook of Economic Growth chapter, tried to estimate m and found m greater than 1 was a better fit than m minus 1. And the difference here, in part, goes back to whether you use all the countries or whether you try to separate the countries in some way, as Bob Lucas did here, between open and closed. Because if you use all the countries, there's some evidence that there are countries that are far behind and are not catching up, are not growing faster. Now, this is just showing you per capita income. The theory would suggest you'd want to do it in measures of TFP, but nonetheless, there are countries that are far behind in TFP that are not growing more rapidly than frontier countries. And so how can you try to rationalize that? Well, strictly speaking, in the model, if you put m greater than 1 and you get a logistic diffusion, you get the following result. When you're close to the frontier, you don't grow that fast. When you're a little bit further behind the frontier, you do grow pretty fast. But then if you get too far behind the frontier, if the distance to the frontier is too large, the follower will not be able to keep up. Growth will diverge, and the income ratio of the follower to the leader will go to 0. Now, that's a stark prediction from a very simple model, but this gives you the sense of the model being able to capture somewhat richer dynamics than just far behind, grow fast. And so what I want to do now is spend a little bit of time thinking about sort of why you might, in a more structural, fundamental economic sense, think that it makes sense to write down models where the further behind you are, the faster you can grow, and why it might also make sense to write down models where the further behind you are, if you're too far behind, you actually can't grow that fast. If the technology you're currently using is so dissimilar from the frontier country, there's not really a lot to gain from adopting the technologies of the frontier country. And so I put a couple on this slide, and I'm happy to spend a little time walking my way through them. But I'm also happy if some of the panelists sort of have some thoughts of their own that aren't on the slide, and we can discuss those as well as I walk through these slides. So the first thing I want to talk about in that classic case of the confined exponential Nelson-Phelps model, there's a very strong, quote, benefit to backwardness. And Pete Clino and Andres Rodriguez-Clare have a beautiful handbook chapter where they talk about this. And the key concept, there's kind of two ways of thinking about this that are quite related. One is that it's easier to imitate than to innovate. And so there's some frontier countries that are doing some innovation, and that's slow, hard work. But once the ideas and the technology has been discovered, it's not as hard to copy it as it is to find it in the first place. And so countries that are adopting existing technologies can grow faster while they're sort of climbing up the rung of the technology ladder than countries that are at the top rung that are trying to push it out and build new rungs. So that's sort of conceptually what this model tends to cover. And there's also, a classic case of thinking about skipping some costly steps along the way. You don't even need to go up the same rungs of the ladder that other countries went up as they went through their process of development. And the classic example is wireless cell phones being adopted directly in many countries, where they were able to skip the costly investment in landline infrastructure. Right, and so that'd be an example of sort of just jumping over some technologies and getting to use these very productive technologies right away. So there might be other reasons why you might think that it's easier to grow fast if you're further behind the frontier. But there's also reasons to think that being too far behind the frontier might act as a barrier to adoption. And so there's a fun quote from a science fiction author, Arthur C. Clarke, who said, "Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic." And it sort of captures the fact that without sufficient human capital, it might not be possible to adopt frontier technologies. There might be some process of trying to understand how to use the technology, and it just might not be so easy to do that if you're currently operating with technologies that are so different from the frontier technology. And so what this is, that sort of analysis led a lot of people to do is to go back to this diffusion equation and try to say, maybe we should put not just your current level of productivity, but maybe your current human capital, measured by something like years of education of your population, compared to, and that should affect how quickly you're able to adopt or not adopt these technologies. Another way of thinking about this that's related but distinct, I think, is thinking about production complementarities. And so there's classic work in a book by Hirschman. Michael Kramer had a famous O-ring production paper, and my colleague Chad Jones has a very nice AJ macro paper about this. And the idea is that production occurs, in many stages. There are many tasks, many you can think of it as intermediate goods that are used eventually to produce final goods. And if you wanted to adopt one particular technology that's being used in a high productivity country, it might not fit with the rest of the techniques, the rest of the tasks, the rest of the production processes that are being used in the country. And so it's sort of like a big push story where you'd have to sort of adopt many of the technologies all at the same time. You couldn't just adopt one and then have that work well with the rest of the system. And so, the extreme example is this Leontief production, but you can have less extreme examples where you have these issues. You can also think that some of the technologies that are invented in very high productivity countries might fundamentally be better fit to being used in those countries and similar countries. In which case, this technology could be high productivity in one location, but not high productivity in another location. So in the agricultural context, you might invent different types of seeds or irrigation patterns that would be useful in colder climates, but not so useful in warmer climates. And in that case, there's nothing to be gained by a lower productivity country adopting that high productivity technology, because it's not a fundamentally high productivity technology, it's a location specific high productivity technology. And finally, one of the last things that I thought of when I was putting this together was thinking about institutional barriers. So Parenti and Prescott and Acemoglu and Robinson in a series of work have thought about extractive versus inclusive institutions, or institutions that support the adoption of technology and profitable enterprise of firms, and institutions that harm that prevent that. And so they might not be able to adopt these better technologies, even if technologically it would be beneficial for them to do so. And so this is kind of all of that's embedded in, what is M in this model, and what is the ratio of the frontier to the follower that you choose to use.
Can I ask something?
Yeah, please.
So do you typically, like when you think about the frontier itself, do you think of this as featuring some kind of decreasing marginal returns? Or do you think of it as like being a constant increase in productivity or some kind of step function or? Yeah.
That's a great question. So at the very end today, I'll try to talk a little bit about jointly thinking about innovation, how that frontier moves over time, and adoption together. So there's these stylized facts that frontier countries tend to grow at 2% per year per capita GDP. That's not always and everywhere true, but it's a good stylized fact. And so we have lots of growth models that generate that. Some of them generate that with decreasing returns in the research function through having more and more resources being used, even though there's decreasing returns in the research function. And some of those models, that's like the semi-endogenous growth approach. And some of those models use linear returns to innovation to allow for balanced growth. And so this kind of one way of thinking about it is there's models of innovation that describe the frontier, and then there's models of technology diffusion that describe how everybody outside the frontier evolves. And then it's natural to think about those two things together. And that's where I think part of the frontier of the literature is. So I'm going to just give you one brief sentence on this slide, and then I'm going to move to the other style of model, which is these idea diffusion models. One of the things what we were just talking about was a very mechanical, almost like a physics type of a model, where just technology flows according to some diffusion, but you're not talking about any countries or any individuals making choices to try to foster that technology development. So in this paper, what Jess Benabib and Jesse Pearl and I were trying to do is stay within the Nelson-Phelps framework, but have there be investment in either innovation or an imitation. Here, innovation has some productivity sigma, and imitation has some productivity that's given by that Nelson-Phelps diffusion curve. But there's going to be a choice to invest in innovation or an imitation. And so the law of motion for productivity is going to be that Z grows according to how much they invest in innovation and how productive innovation is, and how much they invest in imitation or adoption and how productive adoption is. And so this is a way of trying to get some choice into these models of technology adoption so we can understand how environments affect incentives. And so this is a paper that we worked on, and just a good side note, if you're trying to learn as a student or refresh your Hamiltonian math, I think this is a good paper to look at. We walk through all the steps very, very simply. And I have some material, but maybe we can talk about it if anybody's interested later in the Q&A section. But that's just starting to get more decisions showing up in these models. And that's really in these idea diffusion models, something that I think comes to life a lot more. So that's what I'm going to focus on for the next good chunk of the class. So when we were developing these idea diffusion models as a literature, we were trying to find a microfounded process of diffusion that could replace this stand-in for this exogenous diffusion equation. We wanted adoption to be costly and the result of deliberate choice, because then you can say, how can a subsidy to adoption affect the growth of low productivity firms or low earning workers? When you have choice, you can say, is the economy efficient? Is there something that the government should be doing to try to set rules or taxes to try to improve the lives of its citizens? And we wanted to spend a particular focus on the many low productivity firms that exist in the economy. If you just do a sort of plot a distribution of firms by productivity or size, it looks somewhat Pareto-like or log normal-like. There's a large mass of low productivity and small firms, and a much smaller mass of high productivity, very large firms. And a simple thought experiment is like, how much more output could we get if we just got these small, low productivity firms to be using best practices instead of the practices that are below the frontier? And Nick Bloom, oftentimes with co-authors John Roberts and John Van Reenen, have a literature on management where they try to empirically look at sort of introducing better management practices into lower productivity firms in a lot of developing country settings, how that can help just improve productivity, improve profits, improve output, improve welfare. And so that's kind of a motivating fact in the back of our minds, that there's so many low productivity firms out there. Why aren't they getting better? Can they get better? Is it efficient that they're not better? And we also wanted the distribution of existing technologies to influence the choice of adoption, right? So it's not just that every person, every firm, every country knows that there's a frontier technology. We're all targeting our adoption to trying to be that frontier technology. There's a lot of technologies out there. It's not always obvious which one is best for you and your firm. And there's a lot of uncertainty. This also is in the previous example, there was no switching of orders. The countries never got, country 1 and 2 always maintain the same rank in the productivity and income distribution. If you want to start thinking at the micro level of firms, that's certainly not a good characterization of the firm productivity distribution. Some firms grow faster than others, they leapfrog each other. And so these were some of the things we wanted the model to develop. And the typical application of these models is to either firms or workers, which allows a connection to panel microdata, which I think is a nice advancement beyond just thinking about the macro data that's typically used in the Nelson Phelps model. So I'm going to tell you 2 papers that have influenced my life to a very large degree. When I learned them in grad school, they just clicked with me, and I've been writing papers motivated by the ideas I learned in these papers, for the next decade plus. And so one of them is Kortum, 1997, and the other one's Jovanovic and Robb, 1989. And then once you understand these 2 models, which I'm giving to you in words very simply, you'll understand the idea diffusion literature and sort of see where to go from there. So Kortum 97 is a model of innovation via the search for new ideas. There's some idea distribution that's out there, like this Platonic world of ideas. And we as humans are trying to find ideas that are better and better recipes for producing goods that we like in efficient ways. And you're going to search, get a draw from this distribution of ideas and use the idea of it's better than the current idea. And this leads to math on extreme values. So we're always trying to get the max to be larger than the one that we just drew. But if you're drawing from the same distribution, it's getting harder and harder to draw an idea that's bigger than the max. But if you have population growth, you get more and more, and each person is somebody who could be drawing ideas from this idea distribution. You get more draws, even though it's getting harder to get a better idea with any given draw. If you have a power law distribution of potential ideas and exponential population growth, that's going to give you balanced growth. So that's a model of innovation. Jovanovic and Robb is like a proto model of diffusion of knowledge via bilateral interaction. So it's a different model seemingly, but it actually has a lot of connections to Kortum. So there's a distribution of knowledge across people, of ideas with how they're going to, produce. The one farmer has one idea for how to grow wheat. Another farmer has another idea for how to grow wheat, how close to plant the seeds together, how frequently to water it, how much irrigation, how much fertilizer, which fertilizer to use. That's all sort of encapsulated in this productivity term. Very simple, one-dimensional concept. And then there's random meetings. Farmer 1 walks into the bar, meets Farmer 2. They talk about their different techniques. And they say, oh, I was able to grow this much wheat. I was able to grow that much wheat. And so they leave the meeting so that the productivity of Farmer 1 and Farmer 2 next period is going to be some function of their productivities today. And one example of that that's proven to be particularly tractable is that Farmer 1 and Farmer 2 both leave with the best technology, the best way of growing wheat. And so they compare processes. One method is better than the other. Well, the next farmer said, well, I'm going to use your process and I'm going to go out there. If you repeat this process over and over again, you'll realize we're accumulating sort of the best ideas. And there's this close connection in the math between extreme values, which is what Coram used, and differential equations, which is what Jovanovic and Rob use, where you're just accumulating the max either in a recursive way or in sort of a sequential way. And now I think we have some good background to understand these idea diffusion models. So I'm going to give you two versions of this, one in discrete time and one in continuous time. My honest answer is that I wrote this first paper in discrete time because I wasn't very comfortable with continuous time. I didn't know the methods very well. It turns out it's easier to work with these types of models in continuous time. And so my advice is, if you feel comfortable, do a little bit of investment in learning some of these continuous time techniques if this is a style of model you're interested in working with. But it's not necessary. And I wrote my first paper in discrete time and everything works in discrete time just fine. And so I'm going to show you both of them to try to give people with different degrees of interest in working in continuous or discrete time, both types of students should have the opportunity to work with these types of models. But I'm going to kind of go a little bit quicker over the discrete time one, but a lot of the intuition you get from that carries over to continuous time. And so here's the setup. I'll talk about this in the context of firms. And so think about there being lots of different firms and they're heterogeneous over their productivity. And they have the opportunity to either produce using their current technology or to search using a new technology. And the way we're going to model this searching process is that they randomly meet and copy a technology used by some existing producer. And so this has the idea of Coram 97 that you're searching from a distribution to try to get a new idea, but it's not an exogenous Platonic, world of ideas that you're searching from. There's just a bunch of, farmers around, and you're a farmer and you're trying to learn the best technique. And so you're drawing from the distribution of techniques that are actively being used at any given point in time. And so it has the flavor of a pure effect model like this Jovanovic and Rob model. And what happens if you repeat this process over and over again, and you have there be selection on which firms, which people are choosing to search for a new and adopt a new technology, or which firms are choosing to keep producing with their existing technology, that selection is going to endogenously shift weight in the productivity distribution away from low productivity firms towards higher productivity firms. And that can sustain growth in these simple models with some assumptions we can talk about. So the aggregate state in this model is going to be the whole productivity distribution FT. This is not the same FT we had in the Nelson-Phelps model, where it was just the FT there was just a scalar, just the productivity of the frontier. Now the whole distribution matters. And the minimum support is going to be MT. And so I worked on this paper with Perla. At the same time, Lucas and Moll were working on their paper, and a lot of the economics is similar, but our model happens to be analytically more tractable because we give agents a binary choice: adopt or produce. In Lucas and Moll, there's a continuum of time, 0, 1, that agents can choose to spend searching or producing. And our restriction of the choice set to being a binary 0, 1 is what gives us a lot of analytical tractability, but it also limits our ability to study some other things. So now let's just go over this model, and it'll carry over to the continuous time one too. In discrete time, fixed measure of firms, linear production with some capacity constraint, something we'll relax later. But for right now, output is productivity. So let's not talk too much about sort of that production side at the firm level. And there's a source distribution for a new technology, phi. And so this leads to the following value function. They have to choose between two options. So the value of a firm with productivity Z at time t is either produce with your existing technology, Z, and get output Z, and then discounted at rate R, you'll have the value tomorrow of having the same technology because you didn't update your technology. Or you can pay a cost, and in this model, that cost is one period of foregone production. Think of this as a Schmitz and Holmes switchover disruption cost, where it's costly to upchange your technology, so you lose out on production for a period. But then tomorrow, you have the value of having a new technology, and that new technology is drawn from some distribution. So one equation, simple model in some sense. The solution for a firm's optimal decision can be described by a reservation productivity threshold. Why is that? It's very simple. Here, the productivity, here, the value of producing with your given technology is increasing in your given technology, whereas the value of adoption is independent of your current technology. We didn't have to model it that way, but if you model it this way, you get an increasing part of the value function and a constant part. So there's a single crossing, which means that optimal threshold can be described by this, optimal policy can be described by this threshold. All the firms with productivity below some threshold are going to choose to adopt, and the firms with productivity above the threshold will keep producing with their existing technology. And this captures the very simple intuition that low productivity firms have more to gain by going out there and trying to find a technology that other people are using than high productivity firms. They're more likely to bump into somebody that's using a technology that's better than theirs, and then they can upgrade. And so the key idea is that this source distribution that firms are going to be drawing from is related to the existing distribution that firms are drawing from. And so here's the model in a simple picture. If this is the density of productivity at time t, and this is the density of productivity at time t plus 1, sort of, let's say it initially looks something Pareto-like. There's going to be some threshold, mt plus 1. Below that threshold, all these firms are going to choose to adopt a technology. They're going to get a draw from the distribution. They might meet some people that were also trying to adopt, or they might meet some people that were producing. And so the next period productivity distribution is going to look in the following sense, where there's less mass of people below that threshold and more mass of people above that threshold. I'm going to make one more simplifying assumption to make this model way more tractable and simpler to think about. And I'm just going to make the assumption that firms that are choosing to search and adopt a new technology walk through the left door in the morning. Firms that are choosing to adopt to produce and not adopt the technology walk through the right door in the morning, and then all the adopting firms only meet producing firms. They can't run into each other. That's going to mean that there's no chance that anybody meets somebody below the threshold, and it's going to lead to a very simple law of motion for how the distribution is going to evolve over time. And so in math, we're going to say that the source distribution here is going to be the conditional distribution of productivity above some threshold. And in rational expectations equilibrium, that threshold will be the optimal policy that's chosen by each firm. And so this takes a little bit of time of thinking about, but this is just like a big K, little k argument in classic, macroeconomics. There's some threshold that, aggregate capital stock, it's related to the amount of capital the representative consumers is buying, but when is accumulating, but when they make their choices, they take the aggregate as given. And in rational expectations, we make those two things be equal. It's the same thing that's going on here. And so what you get is that the distribution tomorrow is just the distribution today truncated at that threshold productivity level. In math, you can write the law of motion for the density as the amount of firms at Z that are for all productivity is bigger than MT plus 1. You're going to have all the old people that were there and didn't move, plus you're going to have the new people. This is how many new people you have. All of the people that are adopting are the people that are below the search threshold. So this is the CDF here. And then what do? They get a draw from the existing distribution above the threshold. And if you just work that math out a little bit, if you have some initial condition, that has an initial minimum of support, and you have a sequence of these thresholds, you can describe the density at any point in time as a truncation of the original distribution, the time zero distributions at these MTs. And so the distribution is just moving forward in time, lopping off the low productivity firms, and they're getting redistributed into the distribution at higher productivities. And in a balanced growth path, normally we think about just output growing at a constant rate, but now we have a whole distribution. So we need a concept of constant growth, but for distributions, not just scalars. And a very simple one that most people work with is you just have the scale of the distribution changing, but not the shape. Another way of saying that is all the quantiles grow at the same rate. And so when you normalize, let's say we have geometric growth, if you normalize all the quantiles, by the growth rate, then you have a constant productivity distribution. So that's the whole model. It's really simple. You have two equations. One is an equation that describes how the distribution moves over time, and another one that describes the value of a firm, taking as given how that distribution moves over time. There's some fancy math that's associated with that called mean field gains that Ben Moll's been working a lot with some mathematicians. But this is it. That's all it is. Just a distribution moving forward in time and a value function that describes the benefits and costs of moving of adoption. And so in this simple model, if you start with a initial distribution that's Pareto, you can get in closed form a growth rate that's a function of the tail index of the Pareto distribution, where alpha just describes how fat the Pareto distribution is. So a smaller alpha means you have a fat tail, more variance in the distribution, all else equal. And you can have production that's growing, the measure of adopters. You can characterize all of this. Why do I want to say here? I want to say two things. One is you can have a growth rate that's a function of the shape of the distribution. And so a decrease in alpha means you have fatter tails, more inequality. The way to think about this model is that adoption is a real option. And option values are increasing in variance. So you might have seen a McCall search model. What happens in a mean preserving spread in the McCall search model, the reservation wage changes. It's something very similar going on here. And so what we developed is a model that says low productivity firms have the most to benefit from adoption, but the amount that they're going to adopt, which is going to drive growth in the long run, is going to depend on the technologies that are out there for them to adopt. The second thing that I want to say before I move to the continuous time version is you can write down a planner problem, which I'm just going to breeze through here, where the planner is choosing how fast they want that adoption threshold, which firms to adopt every period, how fast they want that adoption threshold to move over time. And if you compare the first best, the planner's outcome and growth rate, to the one that arises in the decentralized equilibrium, the planner gets faster growth and the planner achieves higher utility. And there's an economic mechanism that's going on here that I think is important to understand. There are these external spillovers where firms, in a model of technology adoption, where firms improve their own technology and other firms can then learn from them and improve their technology, the firms may not internalize that external spillover and therefore may not be doing enough technology adoption from the socially optimal perspective. You can reframe that as a free rider problem where there might be firms that are sitting back waiting for others to do all this investment in moving the productivity distribution forward, figuring out the best way to grow wheat, let all the farmers meet up in conventions, talk to each other, experiment. And then once they figure it out, then I'll do I'll go and try to learn which technology to adopt. And so there's a fundamental reason why there's maybe room for government intervention or something along the lines to try to correct this externality that might show up in the decentralized equilibrium. Okay, so what are the next steps? I know I've got about, yes, please. Question?
Yes.
Hi, Andres.
Yes. So, hi. So is it okay to think this as the only cost of adoption here is just stopping your production, updating to the new technology, and then going forward? One would think that maybe that's not enough.
Yeah, that's a great question. This is, I think, literally the next two slides I want to talk addresses exactly that. So I'm very happy you asked. So that was the way I viewed the sort of doing research is sort of when we're developing a sort of newer mechanism that hasn't been explored so much, do the simplest possible model you can that still allows you to explore that mechanism. And that was just a very tractable way of modeling things. Where we wanted to go and where the literature went is we had very simple capacity constraints in that model where output was equal to productivity. We wanted to go to develop a richer model now of technology adoption and embed that mechanism that captures the fact that low productivity firms are trying to get better. How much they want to invest in getting better and how likely they are to get better depends on which technologies are out there, but do that in a much richer macro and international trade model. And so we're going to do that. Along the way, we're going to switch to continuous time. And then we're going to talk more richly about costs and labor and things like that. Then at the very end, I'm not sure we'll have that much time to talk about it, but we can talk about what are firms adopting in the long run. This model here, because we might not have time to talk about it too much later, it allowed you to get perpetual growth via imitation. Something kind of seems wrong with that conceptually. And the reason mathematically we were able to do that is we just snuck in that the initial condition is that the original initial productivity distribution is Pareto, which has a fat tail with infinite support. And what that means is you never run out of ideas to adopt. I think for my view on this literature, these are models that can show you how technology adoption can contribute to growth on the short run or the medium run, but they're not models of long run growth. For that, you need to jointly model innovation and adoption, where innovation is the process that's generating these new ideas so that you don't run out of ideas to adopt. And so we can talk about the role of the initial distribution. That's something that's come up in these idea diffusion models, and the literature's addressed that. I've done some work to address that. Paco Blair and Ezra Oberfeld have done some work to address that, and others. But first, we're going to focus on moving to continuous time and having a much richer economic model than what I just talked about. So continuous time, now we're going to have monopolistic competition, where all firms are the unique producers of their own variety. And there's going to be some profit function, and they're going to be hiring labor. And so this is in contrast to what we just did, where productivity was profits was output because of capacity constraints. We're going to have labor as a factor of production, and labor also as a factor of investment, where investment can be into entry and exit of varieties, and also can be investment in adoption. So we're going to have the same model of endogenous adoption, but we're going to have include an exogenous, in this paper, exogenous innovation, where firms are going to be bounced around because they're hit with some technology shocks. In discrete time, it's like a random walk. In continuous time, it's geometric Brownian motion. And this is going to allow us to match firm dynamics, which is bring a lot more serious calibration and microdata to the literature.
Chris,
We'll also
that was
be
a
able to
question.
discuss transition dynamics, not just talk about balanced growth paths. And so I'll do all of that over the next few slides. Is there a question?
Hey, Chris?
Yeah,
there was a question from the Q&A about what the advantage of continuous time over discrete time is. Can you make sure to point that out as you go over this model?
Absolutely, I'd be happy to. One thing is, I'll show you what gets a lot easier. One way to look at it is it took me forever when I was writing the original paper to figure out this is the shape of the value function in my paper in discrete time. It's piecewise linear with kinks in every time period induced kinks at every productivity level that's induced by the search behavior of every agent in the future. This is a mess. In continuous time, this turns into like Z over R. And so it's like just a lot smoother. cleaner formulas, but also it shows up particularly in the law of motion for the productivity distribution. Here we had to make some assumptions that you only meet firms that are adopting and you don't, or that are not adopting, you don't run into other fellow adopters. And that was how we were able to get a lot of the tractability and continuous time that comes out very naturally. And you can work with differential equations instead of difference equations. We have a little bit more mathematical techniques to do that. And we also have some good numerical techniques to do that, which I'll point out. So I think I have about 10 minutes left, 10 or so. And so I'm going to mostly focus on teaching you some methods. And then in the Q&A, I'm happy to talk about some more of the economics behind this. So I'm going to focus on a paper that I wrote with Perla and with Mike Wah. That'll just, but I'm teaching you the papers that I know the best. These are the ones that I wrote, but there's a whole wide range of literature that uses these types of techniques. And so it's not just narrowly, my papers are the only ones you should look at for technology adoption. And I'll point out some more papers along these lines later. So this is, if anybody's familiar with the Melitz model of international trade, we took the Melitz model of international trade, lock, stock, and barrel, just with almost no changes, except that we have this in continuous time. And we added the model of technology adoption. So we did an n-symmetric country version for tractability. We have some consumers with some period, some expected discounted utility, very standard. We have consumption of a final good is the integral of a consumption of a bunch of intermediate goods. This is the intermediate goods of variety V. They're produced with this CES aggregation technology, where there's a measure of varieties omega that are consumed in country I, sent and produced in country J, and they're aggregated, all of those varieties, with elasticity of substitution sigma. This is where all the action is on the firm side. Very similar to what we did before. There's going to be heterogeneous firms with productivity Z. They're going to have linear production technologies that use labor L. They face the fixed cost and an iceberg trade cost to export, and they're going to have the option to pay a cost to receive a new productivity draw. And so the incumbent firm's decision can be divided into a static and dynamic optimization problem. And then there's also an entry and exit margin to the problem. The static problem takes their productivity as given, and they choose a price and an amount of labor to hire in order to maximize their profits market by market. And there's this fixed cost of hiring labor to export to a foreign market and an iceberg trade cost to ship goods abroad. This is super standard, so I'm not going to go through this today, but the paper lays it out in detail. The dynamic problem is a little bit more interesting, more novel. And so non-adopting firms' productivity evolves according to this exogenously specified geometric Brownian motion, where the growth rate of a firm as productivity is given by this drift term with parameter mu and a variance term with parameter epsilon, where WT is standard Brownian motion. And you can go through the whole paper turning this Brownian motion off, turn mu and epsilon to 0, and you get a lot of the intuition, but you're not going to match the firm dynamics as well. And that has some implications for calibration and quantitative results. But qualitatively, it doesn't really change the behavior of the model that much. The incumbent firm is going to choose when to adopt a new technology. So draw a new productivity Z, just like we did in the discrete time version related to the equilibrium distribution phi. And XT is going to be the cost of hiring zeta units of labor in order to draw new productivity. So this goes to the question that was asked earlier. Instead of just having a period of not producing, what you now have is a cost. You have to hire, it's like an investment. You have to hire some labor in order to try to upgrade your technology. And so the real wage is going to be some component of the cost. And then the parameter zeta is how many workers you need to hire in order to upgrade your technology. And then there's an entry and exit margin, which is going to lead to an endogenous measure of varieties. And entrants receive a draw from the productivity distribution as well, but at a cost that's higher than the cost of doing imitation. And so this is a tractable way of modeling entry. It builds on the work of Urzo Lutmer, who also modeled sort of entrants coming in and getting a draw from the incumbent's productivity distribution when they enter. And then in this model, my colleague, Pete Clino always makes fun of me because I wrote down a model with exogenous death instead of some endogenous creative destruction. This was, some sacrifice I had to make for tractability in this model. So firms just die at some exogenous rate delta. That's the whole basic model. And so what I'm going to do now is just talk to you a little bit about how you solve it, how you set it up, and then show you very quickly some results before moving on. So what a firm is doing here is choosing a time at which they want to adopt a new technology. Mathematically, that can be reformulated as an optimal stopping problem. You continue using your existing technology until you stop. At the point in time you stop, you adopt a new technology and you have a new value that's associated with using that new technology. And there's a really tight link between optimal stopping times and free boundary differential equations. And so for excellent references, I recommend the book by Stokey. There's a book by Dixon and Pindick, and Ben Moll has excellent lecture notes that go through this. And so the idea is to recursively choose a productivity threshold for when to stop, just like we talked about in the discrete time sense. The benefits of adopting are larger for low productivity firms. If you're super high productivity and you randomly go out and try to meet somebody in the world that's producing, the chances they have a better technology and you're going to learn from them is super small. And so the high productivity don't want to adopt, the low productivity do, and that's an endogenous outcome. We can talk in the Q&A section if anybody's interested in sort of what if you could direct your search. Why am I using random search? We all go and try to talk to the smarter people to learn from them. That's an extension, but not in the current model. So the math behind what we're doing is that in an optimal stopping time problem, the value function and optimal threshold from that problem satisfies a continuation value equation, which describes the value of keeping the current technology, a value matching equation, and a smooth pasting equation. So I'm going to walk through these, then show you some final results, and then even though there's a lot of slides left, we don't have that much left to talk about. So this is a little detour into the math. Just if you going from continuous time, discrete time to continuous time, this is a heuristic for how to see how to do that. Just imagine an asset that pays a dividend Z every period. That asset is going to have value equal to the dividend plus the capital gain. And so over a delta time period, you're going to get Z times delta amount of dividends, then you're discounting the value of having that Z tomorrow. If you just do a little multiplication and subtraction and division, you get this formula. And if you take the limit as delta goes to 0, you realize this is a derivative. And you go from a discrete time to a continuous time. Flow value of a value function is just the dividend plus the capital gains. Those are classic, I call it a Lucas asset pricing formula. Well, if you want to go to my model of technology adoption, you have the value function in the continuation region. It's just going to be the flow value, the profits they get from trading their goods to different countries all over the world and selling domestically, plus the capital gains. Very simple. If you have Brownian motion, where the mu and the epsilon are in 0, you get some extra terms. Don't worry too much about that. You can read the paper for the details, but the economics is very similar. You have a value matching condition where MT is the adoption threshold. All the productivities below MT are going to adopt. All the productivities above MT are going to keep producing with their existing technology. And this is the value at that threshold of continuing to produce is equal to the value of adopting. And the value of adopting is you get the new productivity drawn from the distribution of productivities over the support of that distribution above the adoption threshold to infinity, minus you had to pay some cost in order to adopt. The smooth pasting condition is that the derivative of the value matching condition holds with equality. And the right-hand side doesn't depend on your particular Z. And so the left-hand side is just the derivative with respect to Z of the value. And then there's a free entry condition, which says the cost of entry better be at least as big as the value of entry, otherwise firms are going to enter. Okay, so now we're basically at the end of the hard math. The last thing is a Kolmogorov forward equation, which describes how the productivity distribution evolves over time. If you want to ignore the upsilons and the mu's in the Brownian motion, just forget about those bottom terms there. And you have the change in the distribution is the following. There's going to be some firms that are choosing to adopt and some firms that are entering, their new firms. They get a draw from the existing distribution. Then there's going to be firms at the bottom of the distribution that are adopting. And so you have to subtract all those firms from the distribution because they're leaving, they're adopting. And then they're entering the distribution again as a draw from the existing distribution. And then there are some firms that are dying, and because we had unconditional death, they're just dying in proportion to their density. And then the Brownian motion terms, they just bump some firms over the adoption threshold due to the randomness and the drift. And again, you get a solution that's a truncation. You again make the same assumption of initial productivity distribution that's Pareto, and you're going to get that the productivity distribution stays Pareto with the same shape parameter over time. And so we can ask some questions about the model, and then we can do some quantitative analysis. I'm not going to go through that now, but I wanted to put in the slides for you sort of an example of what are the questions that we can ask with this type of model, and what are some of the results that we can get out of that. So a simple result is that you can get the growth rate as a function of parameters in closed form, and you can also get that it depends on the ratio of the average profits to the minimum profits. And this has this very economic intuition that comes about in search models, that what they're gaining when they get a draw, an expectation, is the mean productivity that's out there. And what they're losing is producing with the worst productivity. And so how good it is to produce with the average productivity compared to how bad it is to produce with the worst productivity, that gives you the incentives for how much you want to upgrade. And it's the upgrading through technology adoption that leads to growth. And so that's the type of economics that can come out of this. And you can get all sorts of elasticities of how growth responds to trade costs and things like that in closed form. So last thing that I'm going to say, I have about 2 minutes, I think. I want to tell you a little bit about what you can do with numerics. And this is where continuous time is helpful. And then I'll wrap up and we can talk about innovation and diffusion together if people are interested. And so what we can do is start an economy on a balanced growth path and shock the economy with an unanticipated 10% permanent reduction in trade costs. And then study how the economy transits to a new low trade costs equilibrium. This is something that's very classic to do in economics, right? There's some shock that happens, you're going to be in a new equilibrium, but you don't jump there right away necessarily. Well, the way we did that is you characterize the math problem as a differential algebraic system of equations. And then we use a professional solver in order to compute the transitions. This avoids us having to do our own PDE's, partial differential equation solver, that has finicky dependence on grids. This is kind of like if you're using an optimizer, like a Newtonian method, I don't go and write up my own optimizer every time. I use the people at Intel or Stanford that are professionals that write that stuff. And so in the background, what's happening is there's some upwind finite difference methods that you can see Ben Moll's notes for. But what I want to advertise is that if you go to this GitHub link, there's replication code for this paper written in Julia, and I think pretty good documentation that includes a really simple warm-up case. So if this is a type of model that you're interested in learning, there's a place you can go for the code and documentation that you can really learn step-by-step how to work through it. And you can get figures like this, where upon the trade cost shock, imports to GDP skyrocket pretty quickly and then just grow a little bit longer. But the measure of varieties produced domestically has a long and slow decline. And you can think about what happens to consumption, productivity growth. There's a bit of a jump and then a continued extended growth. And you can think about the welfare impacts of such a thing. And so I think I'm hitting my time. So I'm not going to have time to talk about diffusion and innovation, but I'll just mention that there are some nice models that try to address the issue that if you write down a model of adoption and you want to see how it generates growth, it can't really generate growth in the long term for imitation alone. And so people have modeled innovation and adoption together in order to see where long-run growth can come from. And a key message I'd like you to take away is that adoption can affect long-run growth, even in a world where innovation is the driver of new ideas. And adoption can contribute to growth in the medium run and the short run, even without thinking about innovation. So it's still interesting to think about technology adoption along the way. And so I'll just give you some pointers to Paco Buera and Ezra Oberfeld's paper, and to my paper with Jess Benhabib in Econometrica forthcoming that walk through some of these issues. So let me conclude now. Technology diffusion, sort of broadly defined as everywhere. Cross-country diffusion affects the distribution and dynamics of per capita GDP across countries. It's a large reason we think that poorer countries grow faster than richer countries. Diffusion across firms can affect the distribution and dynamics of firm size and profits. And the diffusion of knowledge across workers can affect the distribution and dynamics of wages. You can see a very nice paper here thinking about how peer effects across workers can affect how good they are at working in the future. What I tried to provide today were some simple models that can be used to structure the analysis of macro and micro productivity dynamics. I omitted a lot of great papers. What I really wanted to do is just give you a framework for thinking about diffusion. And so much work remains to improve the models, and I hope you're all going to be part of that in the future. And part of that is by confronting them with more data, micro and macro. And you can see nice work by Brooks, Donovan, and Johnson using RCTs and survey data in Kenya to try to see how important the diffusion of knowledge is in their context, or Koenig, Song, Sletton, and Zilabati to think about using R&D and productivity growth data in China to think about the importance of the diffusion of technology and innovation for the rapid growth of that, developing, now quite rich country. And so I'll finish there. Thanks for everyone's attention, and I'm happy to stay and sort of take part in the Q&A.
Thank you,
Has a
Chris.
Hello. Okay.
Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, okay, thanks. So in this lecture, we talk about the search model in which agents can adopt the new technology without any friction. For instance, the friction due to patents or any other informational friction, let's say. And in a recent paper by Axetit and artists, when they talk about the diminishing business dynamism, the mechanism is based on the assumption that the diffusion between the technology leader and laggard has decreased over time. So this is something which is different from our ideal model here. My question is, do we really observe this decrease in technology diffusion over time? Is there any empirical foundations for this assumption?
It's a great question, and it's a super tricky one. And part of the issue is there's a sense in which we're theory ahead of measurement, because we don't have a ton of great data on technology diffusion itself. And so, like, if we do innovation, there's a lot of measured data on R&D. There's patents, which people use, and neither of those are perfect, but we have some measures that we think might be proxies for innovation. I think we don't have as good data on the diffusion of technology. There's a couple places where that's not true. And so in survey data, some people look at surveys that say, are you using a new technology in your firm? And is that new to you, or is that new to the industry itself? Trying to separate, did that firm innovate or adopt? So that's one type of data we have. The other two things we do is, one is you can think of technology embodied in capital, and you can look at the flow of capital across countries. And then the other thing that people do is they write down theories that link technology adoption to some observables. and then use the measure of observables to try to back out how much technology diffusion is happening. And some people do that with models of international trade, saying the more two countries trade in goods and services, maybe the more ideas flow between countries. Or you can write down models in which there are productivity dynamics induced by adoption and innovation. And there are patterns of how much adoption is happening and how much innovation is happening in movements in firm dynamics. And so that was kind of the approach that we were taking in this paper that I didn't tell you about, this recent econometrica paper, where the widening of the distribution or the compression of the distribution over time might be, and sort of how much low productivity firms are growing compared to high productivity firms are growing might give you a sense of how much adoption or innovation is happening. There's some research that suggests that there's been a slow, it was IMF research. I think it's that there's been a compression of the distribution of the firm size distribution over time. And that might be a sign that there's more adoption and less innovation happening from the lens of my theory. But it's very hard to have direct measures of diffusion. So it's very hard to give you a direct answer whether it's been increasing or decreasing over time.
Okay, thank you.
It's a great question.
Okay, Chris. Thank you. I can see one probably still needs to do a lot of mathematics to have a full grasp of the lecture. But I just want to look at it from the point of view of research and development, R&D, as an important source or driver of innovation, basically. Now, what is the role of financial development in this case? I cannot see anything of that in the model. Or is there a particular way one can factor this in? Because it's important. Finance drive R&D. And so how do we treat the inequality among countries with respect to the level of financial development and, of course, access to funding for R&D?
That's a fantastic question. A short answer is a lot of the models that I talked about and a lot of the models, related models in the literature, have not yet developed an answer to that question. And so I would say that's a bit of a hole in the literature, is trying to develop a model where you incorporate the financial frictions and level of financial development into the story. So that's just an acknowledgement of sort of where the literature, a part of the literature is. In the Nelson and Phelps style models, one of the things that we were thinking about is sort of how much human capital a country has affects its, quote unquote, absorptive capacity. How much can it perform R&D and how much can it adopt technologies? You can similarly write into that equation the level of financial development of different countries, and that can affect the rate at which they grow via innovation. And we do have models of how financial frictions affect innovation, but it can also affect their ability to adopt technologies. And so I don't know of, I can't off the top of my head think of a great paper to point you to that does that, but in the Nelson and Phelps style model, it's relatively, I think, straightforward to try to do that analysis and see empirically how important the financial development of a country is in that.
Okay, thank you.
Chris, I have 3 questions from the Q&A. The first is related to it probably could be related to the slowing diffusion question that you first were asked. It's by Matias Cortes. Is the shape of the distribution of productivity across firms stable in the balanced growth path? No changes in between firm inequality. Is there a way to think about this in the context of recent evidence on growing between firm inequality? I'm thinking specifically about growing between firm wage inequality, and I wonder if there is a way to link these models to these patterns.
It's a fantastic question. So can I take it one question at a time?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So the models that I showed you were models in which the productivity distribution shape remained constant over time. They are, in my opinion, good models of how the technologies that are available for adoption affect the incentives to adopt, but they are bad models for understanding what determines the shape of the technology distribution itself. And so what we tried to do in this paper is let's write down a model in which the shape of the distribution itself is endogenous and comes out of the varying forces of how much adoption is happening versus how much innovation is happening. And so here we can do counterfactuals by thinking about sort of subsidies to innovation or subsidies to adoption, increased enforcement in patent protection, differences in ability for firms to license technology over time, and how those changes would lead to a change in the shape itself of the productivity distribution, which captures a lot of what you were talking about, sort of changes in firm inequality. If you wanted to then link that to worker inequality, wage inequality, I think you need a slightly richer model of wages or heterogeneous workers than we've developed thus far. But that's something that seems like a very doable next step. So it's a great question to say sort of, where does this shape come from, right? If you think about trading models, the shape of the distribution is what shows up in this ACR formula for welfare gains from trade. Sort of where does that parameter come from? This is one theory of that. But when you have endogenous movements in productivity, then you have a theory that can help to answer these questions that you're asking in a fundamental way.
Thanks, Chris. And then I guess it's actually a series of questions by the same person about firm market power. So I'll combine the two questions and you can address them at the same time. Is it possible to study a discrete number of firms in an economy in this setup? I'm thinking about something like oligopoly model. So firms have market power. And then he says, can you explain conceptually technology diffusion versus business stealing? Both are firms increasing productivity based on other firms. What is the difference in terms of modeling, et cetera?
Yeah, so there's a couple papers that I didn't talk about, but I mentioned a little bit at the very beginning. Actually, let me pull those up. This paper by Akjit, Ates, and Impoliti, and another paper by Shea, Clino, and Nath. They work within the creative destruction framework, but also think about technology diffusion as sort of if there's a different products and the productivity of producing each product can evolve on a ladder and firms sort of step up on rungs of the ladder, you can conceptualize that sort of moving up a rung on a ladder on a product is building on what the previous inventors did, getting to that rung in the first place. And so you can bring a lot of the creative destruction models to thinking about technology diffusion with that perspective. I think what's a little bit different in what we were trying to think about is we think that within product, certainly within sector, but even within narrowly defined product that's relatively homogeneous, there's a wide distribution of production techniques being used to produce that product. And so in the models that we just talked about, there's a lot of low productivity firms that are existing and producing these goods, and they could be just upgrading to better technology. In the creative destruction style models, usually you have like the best firm producing that particular type of good. And so it's in my mind more developed for having sort of frontier firms that are pushing out the frontier, and not so much for having lots of firms that are well within the frontier and how they get better. And so what we wanted to do is try to think about having models where you can have frontier firms pushing out the frontier, but there's just a distinct process by which low productivity firms upgrade their productivity that's different from these frontier firms doing R&D. And so that's kind of a way of conceptually making these different. In terms of market power, you can do both. You can have market power in both. In the trade and growth paper that I wrote with Perla and Hua, we did monopolistic competition, so it wasn't very sort of interesting markups, but you can have different demand functions or production functions that allow for variable markups. And there are creative destruction style models that also allow for thinking about markups. So I think it's a useful thing to try to combine. And I don't think one model, type of model or the other has an obvious advantage in that respect.
Any other questions from the front row? Okay, we have one last question from Dambala Kutela. And maybe this is a better question for Lauren next week, but are there any behavioral explanations of firms learning new technologies from others? I think they have in mind behavioral economics.
Yeah, absolutely. So, so this is not work that I've personally done. This is, in some sense, work that I've done as an as-if representation of firms not being able to necessarily find and adopt the best technology. And so I've done that in a random search way, but you need some theory of why there's a better technology that could be used and why it's not being used. And so one theory could be it's hard to find that technology. Another theory could be it's too costly to adopt that technology. Another theory could be stubbornness in some sense. I don't want to adopt that technology. That you can call that behavioral, or you can frame that in it's risky to choose the new technology. I know it works for other people, but if I implemented it in my context, I don't know if it would currently work. So I don't have any great evidence to point you to towards how to distinguish between sort of stubbornness or riskiness. But I think what you're pointing to is that there has to be some reason why better technologies exist and they're not being used when they're non-rival, when it's feasible for them to be used. One thing you can do is in this Brooks, Donovan, and Johnson RCT paper, they were trying to match entrepreneurs with mentors. And you can see sort of which techniques the entrepreneurs adopted and didn't adopt and why. And so you can get, once you have survey data matched to these RCTs, you can go in and sort of survey the individuals and try to figure out what's going on and why. Or you have to develop very sharp predictions about how a behavioral theory of non-rational behavior would differ from rational behavior. And that's very tricky because a lot of times the same behavior can be described well by both models if you just have a richer sense of what the rational agent is concerned about, or if you give yourself enough flexibility to choose the behavior of the non-rational agent.
Okay, thank you. I want to thank Chris, especially he originally was supposed to go in a few weeks. He made some references to Lauren will be talking more about some micro technology diffusion in agriculture next week. And Ben Mole will be talking more about continuous time methods. But Chris, we had originally scheduled him for Good Friday, so we moved him. He was very kind and flexible to move to today. So if we could all unmute those of you who have access to your microphones and give Chris a round of applause. I want to thank him. And we will see you all next Thursday. Thank you. Bye-bye now.
Thanks, my pleasure.
Oh, thank you for Lauren.
Thank you.
Lauren, Kirsty, and Mandy once again.
Yeah, thank you.
My pleasure. Look forward to reading the research that you do, and I can learn from you.